flowers have been present on Earth since the very earliest times. But because in those far-off days they relied solely on the power of nature to reproduce, their ability to increase their range was necessarily limited, and they largely remained rooted in the soils of their original habitats. The arrival of humans changed that. Irresistibly drawn by these ever-changing blooms, they involved themselves in the world of flowers and changed the history of plant migration forever. But it was only with the advent of the Age of Exploration that humanity's knowledge of flowers and their beauty really took off, utterly transforming garden landscapes worldwide.
The garden is like a stage, and all the plants, Shakespeare said, like players on a stage. They all have stories, where it comes from, how it came here. Then you learn the history of the people associated with it.
Over the past 300 years, the global migration of plants was given even greater impetus by colonization and the pursuit of wealth and profit. The social evolution that followed, however, kick-started an era in which the marvels of the flowering world were made available to a truly global audience.
植物的迁徙，不管是距离，不管是规模，它还是有限的。要靠种子，靠其他的这种条件去传播。 人彻底改变了这种自然的结构。
So, how did flowers manage to overcome the vast distances to satisfy our curiosity and desire about these natural wonders? And what stories of their own did they give rise to during this process of expansion? About 2 million years ago, a new epoch in the natural history of our planet began. The Pleistocene. It was a time of catastrophic climate change. As world temperatures rapidly dropped, a new ice age dawned. Among the first to fall victim to the cold were the temperate virgin forests of the Northern Hemisphere. Many plant species vanished from the face of the earth. But the effects of this new age were not felt everywhere. On the southeastern Eurasian continent, in what is today China, geographical features meant that some of the prehistoric flora was able to survive the climactic shock of the glacial period. What's more, they thrived. Today, some 40,000 varieties of higher plants have been identified in China. This represents a remarkable degree of botanical diversity.
欧洲大陆和英国，尤其在英国条件下，英国我们知道植物种类很少，1300-400种。 如果没有中国的花卉的话，它就是非常单调的。
It was the age of exploration that brought knowledge of the botanical abundance of the East to the Western world. For centuries, an endless stream of adventurers traveled to China in search of its treasure trove of plants and flowers. European impressions of Chinese flowers began with the images found on Chinese porcelain and pictures imported into Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Initially, Europeans regarded these as mere fancies, little more than exaggerated artistic motifs. It was not until the end of the 17th century, after an inconspicuous voyage, that people began to realize that these beautiful flowers actually existed.
So these plants would have been sent back by him from China by different means. We don't know exactly how they came back. We know they are his because it's catalogued that they were his collection. He set out to come back to England and never arrived. He disappeared.
James Cunningham was a Scottish surgeon. So far, no portrait of him has been discovered. However, thanks to these fading specimens and written notes, we can learn something about the character of this plant collector.
Cunningham was the first one to bring back the actual objects themselves. So the plants he collected were the very first specimens to come back from China. So these weren't plants for the masses, these were plants for a great elite.
In July 1698, after 9 months at sea, Cunningham reached Xiamen on the east coast of China. Being for the first time in the home of tea, he paid special attention to what he thought was a tea tree leaf.
I can recognize this as a camellia leaf, but it's not tea because it says here flore rubro, which means red flower, and it's a camellia.
Cunningham collected hundreds of botanical specimens, as well as more than 700 floral illustrations. His botanical collection not only caused a sensation in the Royal Society, but also became part of the founding collection of the British Museum.
And everybody wanted these Chinese plants in the gardens, and that's why we call China today the mother of gardens, because all our gardens have so many Chinese plants in them that without them our gardens would be so much poorer in terms of plant diversity and ornamental horticulture.
Yunnan is world-renowned for its flowers and plants. Some 20,000 species of higher plants grow in the wild here, and that is more than 50% of the total number of plant varieties to be found in China. In 1904, a Scotsman appeared in the dense forests of the Gaoligung Mountains. He was hunting for treasure, collecting specimens of flowers, fruits and leaves, as well as the seeds of exotic flowers and plants. He came to be known as George Forrest. He later learned Chinese and hired a mighty horse caravan. In the forests of the Gaoligung Mountains, he found the extremely rare Rhododendron giganteum. Rhododendron giganteum is the tallest species in the genus Rhododendron. Currently, it only has a very small-scale wild population in the Gaoligung Mountains, numbering around 3,000. In 1919, Forrest saw for the first time a specimen of the Rhododendron giganteum, over 30 meters tall and over 200 years old.
So this is a section of rhododendron that Forrest collected. It's a Rhododendron giganteum. No one really believed him how big it was. So in order to prove his point, he went back to where he'd found the original trees, and he found this 10 years later in 1931, just to prove how big these trees actually were.
A centuries-old Rhododendron giganteum was felled and shipped to the UK. The collection of Forrest opened the eyes of the British to plants and helped British botanists secure their priority in naming the rhododendron and related study.
If you look at some of his collections that he came back with, the big families that he was collecting are the horticultural ones, the things that people wanted to grow in the gardens.
Forrest visited China 7 times in total, leaving his footprints all over the Gaoligung Mountains and bringing home more than 30,000 dried plant specimens, more than 1,000 live plants and cuttings, and 10,000 seed samples.
Some of those were being named as sponsors. So there's a rhododendron Rothschildii, for example. But also other people were then naming some of those new species, and they were naming them after George Forrest himself. So we've got a rhododendron Forrestii.
Collection boxes, cameras, guns. The history of plant migration around the world in modern times records exploration and exchange, and also exemplifies the pursuit of novelty, plunder, and trade.
The first one maybe to grow this rhododendron, it's a big prestige. He was being paid by nurserymen and seedsmen and big estate owners like J.C. Williams at Curhays Castle. So they would have been paying him money to bring back seed. So the Botanic Garden in Edinburgh played the role of a distribution centre for the big syndicates for the seed going out.
It was an era that lasted for over 300 years, during which time Oriental flowers crossed the oceans and entered gardens all around the globe. From cultivated flowers to wildflowers, from the blooms of China's coastal areas to those of its hinterland, countless flowers gradually came to be known by the entire world. Camellia, roses, peonies, rhododendron, chrysanthemum, all attracted craving eyes.
China has always been, for Western gardeners, a source of fabulous plants. There's always something new coming from China. The motivation from gardeners was bring back these plants. We need to have these plants in our garden because they are so beautiful.
As early as the end of the 18th century, King George III decided to enrich his royal gardens with as many plants as his power and wealth allowed him to acquire. Plant lovers gathered at London's docks looking forward to the arrival of Oriental plants. This growing enthusiasm further stimulated the plant trade. Nevertheless, there was a big problem: how to stop these sensitive plants from dying on their long journey across the oceans.
And the journey could take anywhere from 4, 5, 6, 7 months, depending on the weather. So very, very few plants survived.
The sail route between Europe and the Far East needed to pass the southernmost point of Africa. It also crossed several climate zones. This hemisphere-spanning voyage was time-consuming, with plenty of scope for accident and misfortune.
But the difficulty was that the only way to and from China at the time was by boat. They were beautifully potted up in China, they sat on the decks, they were protected with tarpaulins, but the weather was so bad coming back all the way around South Africa, right up. And so the few plants that did survive, people were so excited. Plants came in very, very slowly from China. Gradually they got better. The merchants and sailors got better at keeping them alive, but it wasn't easy.
It is speculated that for every plant that successfully reached Europe, 1,000 died. Moreover, in the event of bad weather, plants were always the first things to be thrown overboard into the sea.
But it was the invention of the Wardian case that changed everything, because the Wardian case was invented by a man called Nathaniel Ward. After nearly 100 years of struggling to get a few plants back every season, the Wardian case, the fact that a closed environment protected plants, that was the game changer.
The airtight glass container creates a small environment for water vapor circulation, allowing plants to survive the long sea voyage. In 1842, Nathaniel Ward's invention changed the migration of plants around the world. Thanks to this partial solution of the problem of transportation, Western interest in collecting rare plants from all over the world intensified.
Coming in. Morning, morning.
Good morning to you.
Excellent.
You look good, mate.
Thank you very much indeed.
I tell you, the lawns were cut on that. All aboard!
Back in the day, owners of unique exotic plants were people of wealth and good taste, such as the Rothschilds, the famous European banking family. One of the English Rothschilds, Lionel Nathan de Rothschild, had great interest in horticulture. He supported a number of plant hunting expeditions by explorers such as George Forrest and Ernest Wilson.
I think he was driven by an absolute passion for horticulture and by the challenge of creating a lot of different species of plants. My great-grandfather always said that he was a banker by hobby and a gardener by profession. Poor George Forrest, who has been collecting dried specimens of seeds in China for both Edinburgh University and some private subscribers, died suddenly of heart failure at Tengji. And Professor Smith writes to me that his collections must be more or less complete. Do you think that anything can be done to secure that the consul gets the consignment sent to this country? And then, of course, it talks about the remuneration, but it would be a great loss.
As one of Forrest's most important clients, Lionel acquired a large number of plants from Yunnan over the course of several decades. He planted them in his private garden on the edge of the New Forest near Southampton.
So that, Tetracentrum sinense, is that. And that's in the garden at home. And it's just there, Tetracentrum sinense.
Exbury Gardens, located by the Bewley River estuary, offers a humid environment ideal for plant growth. However, Lionel was faced with challenges in getting flowers that had come from so far away to adapt to the soil of their new home. In response, he had an irrigation system built to cover the entire garden and replaced the garden's top layer of soil with acidic soil, similar to that in the original habitat of alpine rhododendrons.
He had 150 men double digging the soil for 10 years before he put any plants in the ground. And at the same time, he was sponsoring the great plant hunters that went out to the Sino-Himalayas and were bringing back a lot of different species of plants. His particular passion were rhododendrons, but being a garden with the right soil, apparently he was methodical with his breeding of and hybridizing of rhododendrons.
Unfortunately, Lionel de Rothschild passed away in 1942, before he could see his beloved flowers in bloom. "100 years later, when his great-granddaughter Marie-Louise Agius took over, Exbury Gardens had long been dominated by the blossoms of a variety of oriental plants.
Exbury, when it's in flower, is unlike anywhere else in the world. It is absolutely knockout. It's knockout visually because there are so many different rhododendrons, there's so many different species and types and heights and sizes and colours that are doing their thing, and the scent of some of the rhododendrons as well that fills the air. If you go up to a loderi and you just put your, I mean, it just knocks you for six. It sort of provides a sort of an unbelievable inner peace. Very sadly, I haven't been to China. I would love to go to China. I would love to see the plants in the wild where they were first seen. I mean, I can only imagine the extraordinary, the extraordinary visuals of being in places, like the Yunnan province and seeing the great rhododendrons, the scale of them as well, and coming around the corner and seeing something you've never seen before with it. But a mountainside, that's new. That's never been, I mean, how, there's so many tens of thousands of plants.
In fact, between the 19th and 20th century, in order to access more species of plants, Western plant explorers went deep and deeper into northwestern China. Some of them used photography to record the indigenous environment of these Chinese plants. In April 1925, Austrian-American Joseph Rock set out from Lijiang, Yunnan with his camera and travelled more than 1,500 kilometers to Zhuoni County, which is located between the Qinghai Tibet Plateau and the Lose Plateau. Rock was warmly received by the local chieftain and was provided with accommodation in the Chon Monastery. The monastery was first built in 1295. In the Tibetan courtyard where Rock stayed, he found a unique species of tree peony. Known for its burgundy flares at the base of petals, this tree peony is native to northwest China. Near Zhuoni County, sited at 35 degrees north, between the subtropical zone and the warm temperate zone, is the county of Lintao, the heartland of this unique species of peony. Rock obtained seeds in Gansu and sent them back to the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University, who funded his expedition. Afterwards, these seeds were successfully cultivated in North America and Europe. Therefore, in the West, this peony is also called the Joseph Rock tree peony.
This is what happened. Oh, look, people. Oh, it's Quentin. It's Quentin.
I'd like you to show me your treasures in the garden.
Well, this is the main. I mean, this is beautiful at the moment. Peony rocki.
Where would that come from?
Northern China. Of these beautiful white flowered peonies with the purple centre. We call them all Gansu Mudan group. And I grow 2 beautiful ones. And really, when they're in flower, you don't need anything else in the garden. They are so beautiful. I was so interested in the fact that so many of the plants that we think of in this country as English garden plants actually came from China. How did they get here? Who brought them? Who grew them? And as I'm an historian and a gardener, I started researching seriously and began to write the book that eventually turned into the book that The Gifts from the Gardens of China.
Jane Kilpatrick is a writer and a graduate of Oxford University with a doctorate degree in history. She knows a lot about the history of the Joseph Rock tree peony. Rock was the first to introduce the peony to the gardens of the West, but he wasn't the first Western explorer to have discovered the plant.
And there's a fabulous story about the first Englishman to see these in the wild. Reginald Farrar, he was coming back, he was up in Gansu, he was coming back to his camp towards night. The light was going, and he suddenly looked into the hillside and he could see this white glowing. He went up the hillside to look, and there were these extraordinary peonies glowing in the twilight. It must have been the most phenomenal sight. And he writes a very famous passage about finding these peonies. And now we are lucky enough to be able to grow them in our gardens. They used to be terribly expensive. They're now much more affordable. So aren't we lucky? We can have them in our gardens.
From the remote hillsides to the urban gardens, the innate charm of these flowers provoked curiosity and opened eyes everywhere to a new world of floral beauty. In the age of exploration, man's ability to transport plants over long distances greatly improved. Compared to the faraway European countries, there were fewer barriers to the spread of Chinese flowers within East Asia 1,000 years ago. Their epic journey to Japan, China's close neighbor across the sea, gave rise to an intimate cultural connection between the two countries.
我们看到日本的第一部菊谱是用汉文铸成的，那么他们也描述了很多从中国传到日本的菊花品种。只不过中国的菊花品种到了日本以后呢，和日本当地的野生的菊属植物杂交，形成了独特的日本品种群。
In the 8th century, ornamental chrysanthemums were brought back to Japan from Tang Dynasty China by Japanese envoys. The Japanese royals were fond of them, and during the Kamakura period in the 12th century, Emperor Go-Toba designated chrysanthemum as his personal emblem. But during the Edo period of the 17th century, the cultivation of chrysanthemums became popular among ordinary people too.
菊の花っていうのはいいところがたくさんあると思う。見どころがまずたくさんあるということで、非常にバランスのある高い花だと思いますね。まずお花がとても美しい、気品があり、香りがあり、そして サガニクのようなのもあるし、ちっちゃな小菊もあるし、いろんな種類も作れる。そして枝がまっすぐであるということ、日本人はまっすぐなのが好きなんですね。
In Japan, chrysanthemum is symbolically significant. Sacredness, purity, auspiciousness, and longevity are just some of the qualities it evokes. So it was that a flower that had come all the way from China became the national flower of Japan.
日本人对菊花是情有独钟的。另外呢，这个菊花呢，它也很多时候表现了一种非常柔美的情感，非常柔美的文化元素在里面。日本民族在这个方面，它也有审美需求所以菊花在日本得到了很好的发展。从这个两国文化传统来看，很多东西是一脉相承的，没有太多的差异。
The character for blossom in classical Chinese originates from a pictograph of a blooming flower. This shows that Chinese people have a long history of cultivating and appreciating flowers. Since the Sui dynasty in the 6th century AD, great progress had been made in flower cultivation. And the following Tang and Song dynasties saw it flourish still further and attract wider popularity. In those days, flowers both decorated gardens and comforted souls, with flower appreciation becoming ritualized at all levels of society.
宋代的时候，这个宋徽宗每到重阳佳节的时候，举办菊花花会，与民同乐，在宫廷里面，在街市里面，与百姓共同的观赏菊花。在菊花事业发展当中特别是在宋代，菊花是跳跃式的发展，就出版了第一部菊谱，就是《刘蒙菊谱》，记载了是35个品种。
现在我们看到的这些栽培菊花，从中国首先传到朝鲜半岛，然后又传到日本，此后呢又从中国传到了欧洲，到比较晚的时候进入到美洲。
Because of a flower, he is remembered. This sentence is written by the French to commemorate Pierre Blancard. In 1789, he obtained 3 varieties of large flower chrysanthemum in Guangzhou, China, one of which survived the journey back to France. Since then, autumn in European gardens has been filled with the fragrance of chrysanthemum. The flowers, bound for different gardens, overcame barriers between Eastern and Western countries. Even today, they continue to transcend differences in culture, remaining as attractive as they ever were. This is the greenhouse at Chiswick Gardens, built by the Duke of Devonshire, London's foremost glass building in 1813. But the richest bachelor in Britain at the time just wanted to grow grapes, peaches or pineapples in the 300-foot glasshouse, not flowers. But in 1828, he suddenly became fascinated with the oriental charm of camellia. So, delicate camellias came to be planted in small pots and carefully cared for inside this greenhouse. In 1855, the Duke of Devonshire modernised the greenhouse and planted camellia directly into the soil indoors. Ever since, all kinds of camellias have been permanent residents here, transforming Chiswick Gardens into a veritable camellia paradise.
Well, it says 1794.
So, which ones are from China? We've got
this one,
1,
single
2,
red,
12, 13, they're all from China. 14, 15, 18 so far from China. Thank you, China.
Yeah, well, thank you for camellias.
Right now, at Chiswick Gardens, a camellia show is going on. Residents from the neighbourhood have brought camellias they planted.
For the best bloom in show. And this year, the judges decided that that was the Alba Plana, entered by Claire and Mike Raven.
The camellia, entered by the couple for the show, is a prestigious variety of camellia originating from East China. Pure white, its layers upon layers of petals tilt slightly inward. The ancient Chinese referred to it as the snow pagoda.
The range and diversity of plants that came back, particularly from China, have completely changed British gardens and gardening. Before this time, camellias really were a hothouse flower, so you needed to have money to be able to cultivate them, to have the gardeners and the hothouses that you could grow them in.
In its native climes, camellia grows at latitudes between 10 degrees and 35 degrees north. It prefers warm temperatures. After it was introduced to the UK in the 18th century, people had been cultivating it in greenhouses. It was not until the 19th century that British gardeners discovered that camellia was actually able to adapt to colder weather. Indeed, the issue wasn't whether the plant could survive, but that the country's typical weather tended to affect its ability to flower, a problem not resolved until the early 20th century.
George Forrest discovered Camellia saluensis in March in 1918, and he sent specimens back, one of which came to our herbarium at Wisley and is now the type specimen, so that is the master specimen for that particular plant. J.C. Williams at Camellias was successful in germinating the seed that was sent back by George Forrest. It was then hybridised at Camellias Garden by J.C. Williams, and those Williamsi hybrids, there are thousands now around the world. Those are the hybrids that really brought camellias out of the greenhouse and into gardens, and it's been an incredibly influential plant.
The introduction and cultivation of these plants and the rapid increase in the number of plant varieties brought into being new systems of knowledge and classification that could be applied internationally. Kew Gardens, formerly known as the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, and the world's largest centre for plant collection and botany research, contains more than 33,000 species of plants from all over the world. The glass and steel structured greenhouse, built in the Victorian period and still in use today, is a legacy of the age of exploration. As early as the 19th century, Kew Gardens was the centre of the collection, naming and dissemination of plants in the UK. Scientists at Kew Gardens and the Royal Society adopted the binomial nomenclature formalised by the Swedish botanist Linnaeus. This system of naming and classifying organisms remains in use all over the world to this very day.
One of the things Linnaeus did when he introduced his sexual system is he focused on the numbers of male and female parts in flowers to classify plants. And he wasn't talking about evolutionary relationships like we talk about today. What he was talking about was a way of quickly looking at something, counting its stamens, counting its pistils, and putting it in somewhere where you could make the world a bit smaller so you could identify it.
So it was that the centuries-long boom in plant discovery directly contributed to the massive global migration of flowers and the transformation of the world's garden landscape. When we look back on our interactions with flowers, it's not hard to see that flowers have been part of our history. But when it comes to flowers in the wild and their future development, do we need to understand them and treat them in a different way? If so, how? Gama Valley in Tibet, China, is one of the deepest valleys in the Himalayas. To its west is the eastern slope of Mount Chomolungma. This is a designated key area for plant diversity research and conservation. In the midst of these wild and formidable mountains, you can always find the traces of those who've come in search of adventure and truth.
在之前几天看到的东西都是常见的物种，在这个悬崖崖壁上长的这种变状植物，都是比较特殊的。它长这么大的，可能要几十年。这些就别采了。珠峰东坡伽马沟，这很多地方，很多周围这些山上是没有植物学学者去进行过调查的。这样的空白、研究空白、采集空白太多了。你放眼整个青藏高原、整个喜马拉雅的话，这样的山头太多了，每个山头都有可能有潜在的特有物种。
The Gama Valley is home to a special alpine plant, Mecanopsis tibetica.
Wow, 找到了！过来看，快点，过来看啊！小心点啊，别摔了。哦，2株。
最下面4.5，也就是最蓝色，甚至发黑的地方是最低的。然后上面这个地方9.3。
那么这个绿绒蒿的发现，它不仅濒危，它的发现史也非常传奇。那么这个绿绒蒿最早是在1921年被发现。1922年是谁发现的呢？当时英国派遣了一支登山队伍。那么当然这个登山队伍呢是登珠峰哈。那么他们在登珠峰的之前呢，要做一个全面综合的考察。
Discovered in 1921 and described in 2006 by Gray Wilson, this flower of the alpine rocks has stood witness to decades worth of attempts to investigate it.
"看这个样子，已经开了2个星期了。应该说，是中国产绿绒蒿里面最濒危的一种，最珍惜的一个物种。那它在这种环境，你可以看到这个岩石啊，这些，这个高海拔接近4600米，非常严酷，环境非常残酷，它长得很慢。这个叶子起到一个保护的作用，慢慢的，它像一个拳头一样，慢慢的伸出来，伸出来之后，这个花序伸长，第一朵花，第二朵花，现在已经开了6朵花。那么下面这几个还有几个花苞，1、2、3、4，整个加起来有10多个花苞。那么这几个花苞的话，慢慢的生长。随着它生长的话，它会越来越伸长，最终的话，到了秋季的话，可以达到一个顶峰，高度可以接近1米。它一生就整个一生只开1次花，那么开完花之后呢，当然会结果了，最后成熟以后是一个孔裂的。那么这个 风吹的时候呢，可以把它的种子，一吹一散，里面就弹射出去，里边的种子呢就像一个平抛运动，它只有长得越高，种子飞翔的更远。你经历了，你熟悉了，了解了这个整个青藏高原的这些花、这些草，你在它们身上呢能获得很多这种，可能在我们人类社会里面找不到的那种一种启发。我觉得青藏高原呢是这个地球这个星球给我们中国人的一个最好的一个馈赠，也是不仅是中国人，也是对整个全人类，我们应该珍惜它。
When the gorgeous leaves fall, the veins of life can be seen clearly. Today, understanding and protecting the ecological environment of our native varieties of plants has become a priority in plant conservation. And when we contemplate time and evolution, we come to realize the true significance of our glorious history with flowers, something that makes us appreciate their place of origin and how every silent bloom is the culmination of millions of years of development, the fruition of the eternal strength of life.
And we've only been on the planet a very, very short time. We're alone in terms of our evolutionary relatives. Plants, on the other hand, are not alone. There are many, many species of plants. But I think we are connected to everything because we are a species, just like a species of rose or a species of camellia. We are a species of the natural history of the earth. So in that way, we are all connected.
人类还是要谦卑的，更多的是去做一些有利于自然、能够正向发展的事。虽然我们现在很强大，但是我们要知道，我们的在某些方面还是，能力还是有限的。
The most precious thing nature has to offer us is the awe and reverence it evokes within us. Today, as we re-examine history and plan for the future, it becomes ever easier for us to understand the meaning of life contained in a flower.